Hello everyone, today we talk about archaic Roman warfare and especially the one from the 8th to the 5th century BC. We will understand the timeline a bit better. This is royal, tribal, feudal, Roman. These are the adjectives you can use, as we will explain now, to indicate different characters of Roman culture at this time. As we know, this is a period, so the one predating essentially the early 3rd century BC, starting from, of course, not the Second Punic Wars, but the beginning of the century in the inverse BC count, as essentially shrouded in myth, besides just history, as all Indo-Europeistic fans also know because of the studies of Dumézil and all the other ones about the Indo-European core root of Roman civilization as such. We already talked about Roman archaic warfare here and there because I think it's still a largely overlooked topic, if not academically, and I've actually spent the last months giving a look at how much has been published actually in these topics, and I think that academically there is a gap still there, right? There is the topics have been covered, but in such a structuralistic, relativistic mechanics, something scared, for example, of pointing out all the spiritual meaning, etc. That I think not just we will have to start looking at Roman warfare through that lens, but also giving a bit of broader background about what the world, what Europe was at the time in other videos. In fact, I'm planning, this is the first video of yet another mini-series. I talk about series, but you don't have to be scared. I mix everything into the bigger cycle. It's a sort of broad, again, divine order that I organize myself to just have a well-calibrated, well-balanced diet, let's say, of historical food that will bring us through the creation of the Roman army, through the actual, in fact, origins of Rome, but also the acquaintance with, for example, the art of war of the Mediterranean in general. And this is not the usual thing, like, okay, but mostly during the Punic Wars. Right now, it's something before that, right? It's largely during the 4th century. That's the key one I already discussed here and there. And especially last spring, that moment, mostly in function of the Roman conquest of Italy, but not much in the details of the actual development, in that case, of the Manipular Legion, right? That can be overlapped in a sense with the Serbian one. We will deepen this this concept because, of course, there were classes already established, at least in the essence of the military organization, but again, it's quite complicated to understand what actually happened, which is mostly the best way to explain that is anthropologically. And in fact, starting from the very roots of Roman warfare, as we will do today, will help us with that. And I say this because actually I'm passionate with the topic from years, but as a medievalist, I still haven't spent enough time like making videos in depth about this. And I think it's very important to start. And this phase of Roman warfare is incredibly fascinating because when you read these articles, especially written by people who normally don't have a military historical background as specific, etc., and not even necessarily in Indo-Europeistics or history of religions broadly meant, and or in other broader aspects of politics, war, and society, they tend to put things together, make this tidy, nice article saying, well, this is all the evidence, we can make speculations about this and that, and hyper, analyzing this because, of course, today it's all about narrowing down everything to the very minimum, right? And in the process, essentially forgetting the broader meaning, right? The synthesis, the core fact of this whole dynamic. It's like saying, what is, the first banally bronze plate armor documented in Romano-Italic warfare. It's something essentially in Etruscan warfare dating from the 6th century BC. It's the Monteleone chariot, if I'm not wrong. In fact, I inserted some pictures of also here. And yet, you perfectly know, for example, that that's just a proof. It's an archaeological one, but still inherently an iconographic one, because it's just a representation depicted on a chariot that survived. But of course, we perfectly know that the Italian peninsula, as much as all continental Europe had and beyond, had this say most of what we discovered throughout the other massive evidence about Bronze Age warfare told us a lot was going on there. There is the problem, in fact, even of chariot warfare. How important was actually chariot warfare among the Romans in the early days? Well, it's something that is not discussed simply because there is no evidence. But we perfectly know that that thing was there at the same time. So it seems to me that the historical tendency, even from professionals, is to basically just say, well, we don't know, so we can't even basically write an article about it. And I understand that because very often I work in the same way. Like if I have in my field of specialization like not enough evidence to make a juicy article, and I have like other stuff, and I try to be much more in depth and still much more let's say comprehensive than most of my colleagues do, really, and I'm starting to publish at a consistent rate so that sooner or later you will also discover who I am, etc. But it's obvious still that you have to address the topic because it's very important in function of Rome. That is not exactly the last of historical topic in terms of the legacy of the entire history of mankind that could actually be gotten down to that in many ways. Maybe it's a bit too reductive in a way, but there is something, as you know, about the traditional imperial Catholic reading of course, the rise of Rome. If you don't know what Catholic means in this pagan context, well, I hotly recommend you to watch more of my history of religion videos, because I think we are in the third millennium. The fact that people have forgotten this meaning is horrifying, to say the least, but everybody can actually learn it just with a click. So I try to be more vocal about it, to try to essentially sensitize people about the fact that that we live in an embarrassingly undereducated reality, that nobody knows how long will it take before it finally destroys itself completely, just out of sheer lack of moral force, not through necessarily the act of the accident, the nuclear war, whatever. It's much worse than it seems already. And I'm not referring to anything in particular, telling the truth, because I think that most things about which people complain today is complete whinery and ridiculous at every political, military, and social level. So the entire populistic thing is something that I use mostly to clean the sole of my shoes, telling the truth. And I think that Roman history is the sort of gospel of this all, because when you realize not just what Rome accomplished in absolute terms, but in relative terms at the beginnings, and I made a video titled explicitly, on the moral superiority of Roman civilization and Indo-European interpretation. Well, just realize that if you are on this channel because you think that I'm making sort of ethno-nationalist history of your country, whichever it is, you are one of the people that will go under the fastest in the world. Right, in the very next few, decades, right? And that's exactly what you deserve, because the imperial Catholic Roman universal tradition is something that, if you don't know about, you basically cannot frame anything else. Like starting from religion, from paganism to Christianity, to whatever you think that is your little factionalistic obsession to pretend that you're fine just the way it is and not a complete moral, cultural, and personal disaster. Just know that that's the point, right? You will never be able to be God in that fashion. Now, this video is not about history of religion, as a matter of fact, but it touches on certain naturally ethical, sort of broader dimension of what this world really was. I'm still uncertain by now, recording what the title is going to be, but I would like to stress, perhaps in a provocative sense, the feudal character of Rome, because you have heard the Age of Kings, right? And the Roman tribes, the Tribbles, but the sense that this was a feudal world, right? So something that you have been saying is essentially depicted as the opposite, right, of the alleged republican and democratic Romanity, as opposed, for example, to the feudal Middle Ages. Well, just know that this is what it was, and that Rome, of course, throughout all the entire empire, can be seen as essentially a feudal system to some degree, at least in the broader hierarchy of course, very specific order of superiority and inferiority of cultures. That's another thing that actually I've been told, that Romanity is essentially everybody can be a Roman, meaning, everybody gets free rights, or at least, rights that are equal to one of others. That's factually incorrect, both in absolute and in relative terms. It never existed historically. The Roman Empire lorded over the world, right? Essentially redeeming it, right, in its own fallen nature, and representing the golden age. Then you have, of course, a decline. That's where all the meaning of Christianity, and so also the continuity of Romanity in part, but especially of the Catholic sense, and what was to be done with that decline, which is a bit the same thing that happened among the Vedas, with Buddhism, that was actually just stemming from that, and in a sort of spiritual, rejection of all what had been mistaken. In fact, at the time, essentially a populistic empire, so a world in which the lesser people are made believe to be worth anything, right? And so the failure of the entire system, just like today, right, in many ways, procured the crisis because of the people, not because of the terrible elite, right? If it was the elite's fault, that really was the case, just like it was, I don't know, at the end of the Ancien Regime or whatever, but it was always complementary. It could have not been the failure of the elite without the one of the people, and vice versa. And this had different stages of decadence through the history of mankind, and that has just gone worse ever since, right? There's not been cycles of reemergence that ever topped what Rome had specifically accomplished. We could make the case for any other empires before, but I don't want to digress too much along this path. But it's important to stress the essence, of course, of will to power, the principle of action that was behind Romanity. Again, the aforementioned video on the Roman superiority of Roman civilization explains this quite clearly. It made it clear also in other videos about the Hellenic civilization, about I covered mostly, I made the Vedas, I made the Norse, etc. So we are also, I have to make others, of course, and lots of other sub-videos to substantiate these things further. But if you look at the Indo-European Sacred Fury, for example, and many other, the Age of Order video, for example, in the Romano-Celto-Germanic religion, etc. Like, those are deep videos that tell you what I'm talking about, and that I can assure you that nor from school nor from university anyone is going to talk to you about, even though it was written about that, and I have in turn an even more sort of customized view on the base of some works, some studies that some of you have probably also never heard the authors of. And so what you get regarding that on my channel is wholly original, and I understand the level of of confusion, right, of disorientation, of some sort of lack of references, or even just terminologically. But that's why I make all these videos, and as at least I don't assume cathedratic tones, but as a scholar, at least I presume that for anything that I say, you have heard everything I've ever said. That's how you behave when you go to a doctor. You don't pose a question if you actually at least or criticize authority if you actually don't know what this guy has done for years at this point, and just on YouTube with more than 1,800 videos. In any case, the archaic Roman army, right, the feudal Roman army, if you want, or the royal or the tribal one, right, faithfully reflected the early constitution of Rome, right? Its first organized form, of which we have news, but that is also quite, in fact, universal in a sense, is traced back to, of course, Romulus, his legion. Never made a video about Romulus, Remus, etc. But the story is all pretty well known, at least not highlighted in the most in the crudest part, because there is here to explain why Rome, for example, what was the civilization of the axe and of the deer. But most people don't have an idea. Of course, it's a Nordic thing. Not just the Roman fasces, but also the deer as the sacrificial victim still of royal blood that had to be cut to pieces with an axe, and that also explains the incredible Roman taste for decapitations from what was before human sacrifice in the best of Indo-European tradition. The same Legion of Romulus talks about that royal blood spilled, because without that, as I explained in the video about the way of the left hand, right, the way where the fire of death blazes, there cannot be self-actualization and divine transfiguration without that risky tension which would happen through combat, as a matter of fact. So that actually the she-wolf is not just the suckling the twins, is not the only symbol of the Indo-European sacred fury infused by Mars, because remember the Romans had split this function to Mars specifically, as opposed to Jupiter, like instead in Norse religion, where you have still everything one into Woden. But again, they are hypostases of the same god, like any other being whatsoever. But also the little deer that was there since the at least the Central European ancestors of the Italic peoples that eventually marched into the Italian peninsula. And founded most of, in fact, of the inhabitants' culture, speaking still, in fact, an Indo-European language, etc., including the Oscans, the Latins, the Faliscans, etc., deeply informed in their culture. This is present at the root of Rome. It's a typically Indo-European symbol, but surprisingly enough, I'm not even sure that there is a work explaining the role of the deer in Roman culture. Guess why? Because there is not a huge deal of deer representation in Roman culture, except in some other, like, not just Diana, but for example, at a point the deer was associated to Bacchus, Dionysus, and part of the reason was that was the element, in fact, the way of the left hand, the fact that the sacrifice, the sensual dimension, this one you had to be exposed to, the deepest forces of the darkness, had to be unleashed in order to accomplish the transfiguration. And the crystal, Apollonian, Uranian, virile nature of Rome, and the fact that they basically reversed essentially the pelagicization, we could say the chthonization, etc., of the Mediterranean, redeeming the world, and according to Christianity also allowing that in the moment in which they reached their peak to eventual decline, eventually being the same birth of the new Apollo and Christ, etc. But that's, of course, also another tradition. The Romans had their own thoughts initially, and Christianity surely were not appreciated until you understand what was the actual deal from a universal point of view, and so also the lack of criticism at some point of admission that when you reach the top, you have to maintain that and even push forward, and not instead gradually going down. The first organized form of the Roman army that we know of is constituted on the basis of 3 tribus, which is connected, of course, to the word 3, standing for the third part of the people. 3, that's what we get from Latin. The names of these tribes were famously enough the Ramnes, the Tithies or Tithienses, and the Luceres, that derive, according to the ancient historians, from the 3 components whose fusion notoriously gave rise to Rome. That is, the first from Romulus. So these were Latins, right? These were thought eventually later also with the idea of descending from Aeneas as kings of the Latins, that technically the twins in fact descend from, even when Romulus founds Rome. The second from Tatius, that represent instead the Sabines, another Indo-European people that however had been strongly influenced by lunar Chthonic culture, especially from the Etruscans, likely, but like also by other influences in the rest of the Italian peninsula, and that were instead dominated by the Romans achieving this literal revolution in the inversion of the generation of mankind, right, of the fall. And the third from this touch of hierarchy, that is, from the Luceres as the inhabitants of the sacred woods. So Lucus is technically this. We're talking probably about the Etruscans here. We should make an entire video just to explain this, because there are various views on, say, the various meaning of this all, and so, of course, in which function this work, because everybody knows this notionistically, right? But from the sagas that eventually were put together in the 1st century BC to write the comprehensive histories of Livy, etc., of course, we understand that everything was incredibly, like every single word had a like a universe behind that regarding to the traditional meaning of the foundation of Rome. As far as the army is concerned, each tribus was divided into 10 curiae, literally assemblies of men in arms, because the term curia comes from coviri, right? So the idea of men, right, in a band, just like in the fasces, which therefore were, so these were typical war bands, right, as you understand, which therefore were at the same time the basis of the political and military organization. We all know what kind of business Romulus ran, right? He was at the head of his sceleres, so some knights essentially that carried out this fortune in the typical sense of the Ver Italicum, so the sense again of this new generation of heroes that had to migrate outside of the previous system and to devote themselves to a divinity. As we will see, this would keep happening even up to the 4th century BC, and still was ingrained in Roman culture and mentality throughout the entire, like the rest of their history, in literal war bands of devotees to a divinity to whom they belong, that they technically became just the extension of, right? So as we learn also from Celto-Germanic war bands, etc., these men were selected. Every once in a while they picked somebody to sacrifice, to kill, just to keep the sense of this fact that you didn't belong to yourself anymore. You could not achieve transfiguration if you did not become victor and victim, a sacrificial victim himself. This is part, like the same sense behind the devotio, even in times in which, of course, the thing could be carried out by in a much more political and socially stratified system. Think about the same consuls that sacrificed themselves like that, and the purpose of this band was, of course, to essentially go out there in the world, seizing, achieving, molding the world of their own image, massacring their enemies, seizing their women, the rape of the Sabines, as the example here, and, in fact, forging a new breed, right, of chosen people, right, of superior people that had proven to be more, to be better the example of their enemies, of course, but that were capable of essentially elevating their own fallen nature as humans to a higher degree through spiritual force, which is not a mere reflection of the flesh, but something greater. And this is the concept that stands behind the entire tradition. And so the same concept of Rome. You do not become a Roman for some odd reason, but because you must have proven that you know how to master your own mortal dimension by essentially proving that you have that spark of divinity, and so that you can belong to the chosen people that are destined to rule the world, and of course everybody that lives in there. But giving them a chance. And so this is, in fact, the deepest meaning of even much later concept like Nazianzus one of, you made a city of what before was the world, because literally you had made this stock prevailing in a metaphysical sense. The same reason why later the same Germans chose the Romanity of the empire, right, to be stressed in the holiness of it. And this thing died just in the 19th century, by the way, so it's not very far away time, because Rome was seen as the one that had actually done the thing, right? And it was recognized that the capacity of transcending alone could not be done but through the medium of Rome herself. And of course, that's a lot of stuff I plan to make videos about the medieval Ghibellinism, let's say the role of Christianity there, one of the Germanic peoples in this process was, as you know, crucial during the Middle Ages, etc. But in, again, the truest and deepest and divine and absolute and extreme meaning of the imperial Catholic tradition, which is the same one that was inspiring Romulus and his Kellers, his followers, his retinue. And needless to say, the foundation of Rome set this trend. I mean, the killing of Remus is that thing, right? There is no human, earthly, fallen bond that can essentially eliminate the holy city chosen by God to save mankind. This is the basis of Rome. 3 tribes, right, that have this, of course, tripartite Indo-European function, something that we've seen in the video about the Fortuna Caesaris, overlapping also with the Clausewitzian Trinity. Importantly enough, the Romans are, of course, the warriors. The Sabines are the people, or the women, if you want to say, the chthonic element. And the Etruscans are this sort of sacerdotal class. Each tribe, as you understand, this was pretty miscellaneous, also with other groups. The sense is behind the same etymology of Aryan, that is noble in the Indo-European language. So the sense that the nobility achieved by spiritual elevation over the fallen kind, right, was greeted even to be part of this stronger stock. So the Romans, as the Latins, were the prevalent ethnic group in the Tiber, in the lower Tiber Valley, in the foundation of Rome. The Sabines were literally actually next door, right? We're further north, but let's say there are some areas within the same historical center that were occupied at a point by the Sabines, so that they were that close, right? And of course, Etruria lay just on the right bank of the river, right? So even in today's Rome historical center, that at the time wasn't very much understood like that because the city was from the other side. But on the right bank, it's Etruria, right? Technically, and that's also where the most commercial, like the exchange, of course, the frontier with this more advanced. Like the Latins again were brutally violent, still in fact tribal Indo-European peoples. They had a much more compact social cohesion because they were also much less stratified. The Etruscans instead were a bit like they were not Indo-Europeans in part, even though still when we're talking about these peoples, we look at the hegemonic cultures, not really talking about the entirety of the population. That's a different thing. but they had notoriously a much more violently stratified society, right? They had just a handful of landowners. All the others were basically serfs of some kind. They were very elitistic in this regard, and of course very hierarchical in that even hieratic sense we're pointing out regarding to their power, to their wisdom, to their spiritual connections. So today we do not talk about the Etruscan rule of Rome that I discussed in other videos, and so how that informed the development of the Roman army. But say the most interesting aspects are mostly happening when the Etruscan domination ends, and so the Romans start building what we recognize more closely as the later legions that we know. But since today we talk about, in fact, the tribal army, the feudal one, we have to point out, of course, the influence of the Etruscans as well. As elitistic was also, as we were describing the various chariots, and that we even find in part, we find Etruscan ones, we find Latin ones. There is the beautiful 6th century one of Alba Longa, by the way, that at some point was much more powerful than Rome, because these Latin cities were still acting, as you know, in a sort of league, but they were trying to lord over each other, etc. So Rome had a quite, in fact, turbulent history. Like, these were quite, again, warlike populations, also threatened by even the much more wild, savage, and primitive of the Apennine heartland. So it's a sort of, this is what you observe in development civilization, that the best civilizations are the ones that come out of the perfect balance between tradition and modernity, right? When you find that golden section, you take off, and Rome is, I think, the single most powerful example historically of this dynamic, right? Italian warfare, remember when I say Italian here, I literally mean the geographical sense, because of course there were lots of other peoples that lived in Italy, but they weren't Italic, right? And the Etruscans were one of those, for example. And Italian warfare wasn't, let's say, it was quite, for the times, shaded, because if you look at the colonies of some of the more advanced civilizations on the coast of southern Italy, and if you look at the Celts that at a certain point migrate, and say Celticize the large swaths of the north and even part of the center, they arrive to in fact plunder Rome. Even though there is no archaeological evidence of destruction at that time, probably the Romans paid a tribute after the Allians. Still, there is the ransom. There will get to that point. We don't talk about this now, because that's mostly crucial for the genesis of the Camillian army, and so mostly what we actually call the manipular one, even though this took somehow a century, the entire fourth one, before the Livian legion described by in fact Livy in the last at the end of the before the last decade of the century, in fact, practically is, right, to eventually just evolve in capacity until like the Second Punic War. Here we are in a completely different scenario, right? Warfare is really heroic, as we will see now. Chariots were not, can say they were dominating Italian warfare, simply because the orography of the country doesn't render it that easy, right? It's a quite hilly territory. At most, it has this mountainous hinterland. There are, of course, that doesn't mean that just ipso facto the chariot is not used, right? We know especially that also from other cultures later on that these things could go everywhere, right? But there is the sense that especially in Latin warfare, infantry was more powerful. It's a bit like the sea peoples, right, against the Bronze Age civilizations in the end of Chariot Warfare. These were bulkier, tougher infantries because they were somehow less stratified against societies expressing them, and that put down this somehow more sclerotized elite lording over lots of essentially marginated people, because they had that in fact divine force from their side, Cavalry, however, was actually very developed in Italian warfare. This is something people get wrong for some reason all the time, mostly because of anti-Romanism as far as the comparison with the Celts, right? There is always somebody whining that, the Celts had the best cavalry, or it's BS, right? The Romans had actually even a stronger cavalry than peoples like the Carthaginians or the Numidians that had quite advanced cavalry, had a few but good. Italy is not this place where you have excellent horses, but you have good breeds, right? Also, there aren't, say, surrounding peoples that really are just mounted, like nomadic ones that, in fact, did affect the surrounding regions bordering with them. So very often the Romans made up the myth of the Celtic cavalry, if anything, because they had lots of cavalry, but in terms of collective training was poor, and the Romans maintained through their heroic tradition that put the knight, as you know, also with the equites, etc., at the center of the, say, superiority, in the sense that the knight, differently from the other soldier, didn't have to provide his own equipment, was the state that paid for it, because they had proven they were superior people to others, and this was initially, essentially, the equites become an order on their own later on, when also infantry is really prevalent in many ways, but it stemmed from the same feudal culture of Rome. Just like during the Middle Ages, it was all a cultic militarism around the idea of knighthood, of chivalry. This tribal Rome is exactly this. In fact, we will realize that even in terms of numerical proportion, cavalry was the same one in the Middle Ages. And right, there are also many instances of Middle Republican warfare, especially from the Italian allies, of actually massive and amounts, and especially a solidly good quality of social cavalry, of the Socii, right? So equestrian warfare is perhaps the single most brutally underestimated one in Roman, especially in the archaic times. In any case, it's also important, again, to stress the importance of infantry, right, throughout all this. The fact that Rome was, for example, a city, or evolving as such, because also concepts like classes, citizenry, etc., that belonged to a later statual reality. But the statual reality came together not differently from how the communes did during the Middle Ages, right? They were essentially guilds led by oligarchs, with the patricians, the senators, as the family heads. Just think about the right of the pater familias, that has the right of life and death over everybody in the family, women, children, whomever, right? That were the ones, in fact, had this divine contact, and that were the ones moving these tribes, and the clans that made them up. That's how they came about, right, in the first place. It was just all one with Roman identity to be a person who had to exterminate large numbers of people in battle, because it was literally the only way to go, right? It's just like you look at, I don't know, the Norse religion, like the idea at that point, like even throughout paganism, etc., just in later Roman times, had the sense that fate had somehow just won in a way was there. So the sense that death is incumbent, especially the one in battle, somehow unavoidable, and or at least a shame not to die in battle. What this was the thing, right? The only worthy death, the only capable of essentially of saving yourself and the others, was death in holy combat, right? And I made a video about the meaning of the Indo-European holy war from Ariona to the Templars that explains exactly this, right? That was the only possible way to hope to save mankind as a whole, dying in combat. And ipso facto, it's not just just dying in combat per se, the thing, right? It's just like in the Norse religion, you're just going to Valhalla, but the storming of the Asgard has yet to happen, and nobody knows whether even all the fallen heroes will be enough to win, right? So there's not actually a simple salvation. There's no such thing, and that's just a male, virile, militaristic thing, right? It's a function. That's the reason why you find even in, I don't know, we will talk about the Longobards soon again, but in that case they had in pagan Germany in the first centuries, the split cemeteries for the women and for the men. You say, why did they do that? Well, because they had that brutally and rigidly and unfortunately patriarchally exclusively based culture that was specific very much about the fact that men had to die in holy war as the only purpose of a man, right? So the sort of naturalistic, populistic bullshit that, I don't know, these were peaceful worlds where also, women were really free. Do you have the palest idea of what the hell European tradition actually is? Have you ever studied anything about religion? Do you even know what your own religion sometimes actually means? Because I think that most people that call themselves religious do not have the palest idea of what the hell they're thinking, or they're presuming to claim to believe in. These words were founded solely, totally, exclusively on the brutal difference in quality between human beings. For the ultimate idea that we're all risking to vanish together with the entire world in darkness and nothingness, and they had the only single functional societal purpose of working, having this divided functions in order to redeem the entire mankind through the conquest of the universe, to become essentially God themselves, or to be up to God by succeeding in positive, authoritative, rigid, virtuous way. This is the meaning of the Roman virtus, as a matter of fact. It means manhood, right? And it stems from that in achieving this task. This is the only thing that exists in the world at the time. There's not another belief. You have been told that there were different religions. There is no such thing. They were all different expressions of the same concept to the degree different peoples had posed themselves in relation of this thing. But it was universally known that this was the same belief, and any other, say, deformity and this plurality, polytheism never existed. It was just the degree in which certain fallen divinity had taken form in the world, right? But the meaning was only one. There was only one God, and there's never been any difference in this regard. So each Roman tribe, according again to later sources that explain this, and that are in a sense spot on, because as we will see, it all makes sense for those also, we know anthropologically, compared from other peoples throughout various eras were documented as such. Each tribe had to choose 1,000 men, right, 100 for each curia, as were essentially some clans, thus creating a legio, a legion. So literally a selection, right? This is what's a picked unit, like a choice, right, of the best. Remember this, some others were not enough, right? Of 3,000 men divided into 30 Canturiae, the centuries. So you understand this is a decimal system based also on this at the top by the amount of these tribes that make up Rome herself. And so there is, of course, a devotion towards the cohesive principle. The metus still is one of the most fundamental notions, identity notions of the Roman mindset regarding to war and the enemies. I must make a video, by the way, confronting all the etymology of the various Indo-European terms about war, because they are all basically the same, and they were in fact some of the most important words in the vocabulary of these peoples in the first place. From this moment on, so whenever this thing was formed, the Centuriae became the basic unit of the Roman legion. So when Romulus had founded Rome and her army, the Centuriae became the basic unit of the Roman legion. And we know how much that is true, because they were some of the most important tactical units of the Roman army for centuries, right? For centuries and centuries. Furthermore, each tribus also conferred 100 horsemen, thus forming a contained but substantial cavalry corps of 300 men, right? So 1/10 of the number of infantry. These 300 horsemen were divided into 30 decuriae of 10 men each. Hence, you have this the NCOs there with the centurion, the cavalry, you have the decurion, etc. So it all stemmed from that early of a decimal system in the organization of the Roman army. So the cavalry, as you understand here, is not negligible, and we'll talk about it in a while, right? Here, by the way, we're talking about horsemen, but that early in time, of course, chariot warfare with the winged glory represented universally for other centuries, by the way, and throughout the entire Roman iconography. Marcus Aurelius also depicted quite. It was the only symbol again existing entirely, like the hero riding into battle on chariot guided by the victory. That is also essentially the same transfigured soul, say chthonic element transfigured into an Apollonian one from the greater forces, the darker forces of the hero that he had managed to tame, and that guides him just visually and into the divine, right? And you find this also, in fact, in the pictures that I've put you here. For example, the Monteleone chariot, etc. It was completely typical, right? It was used in the entire universal meaning of war among every people at the time. The prevailing opinion among, say, modern historians believes that such tribal organization was not introduced by the legendary king and founder because essentially it reflects some sort of more orderly, standardized organization that, according to what we know about the development of Rome, urbanistically, archaeologically, topographically, would say also, and so politically and socially, economically, etc., could have been possible towards the end of the 7th century BC. So when Rome was shaping up as a city-state, but the chronology here is, I wouldn't say it's not so radically important as such. Like my opinion in the first place is that until the 4th century BC, even though the Etruscan kings had established some kind of sort of more standardized organization, of course, especially the picked forces of the patrician families were still very, in fact, unstandardized. Right, we will see it now because essentially the affirmation of also the famed Roman discipline, also later on, of course, after the Etruscan period, etc., did stem from this pre-existing moral load, but also the collective training, of course, that becomes the hallmark of all the superiority of military civilizations, and that the Romans were, of course, the most famous in history for the sheer level of brutality and effectiveness that it could achieve in their imperial goal of world domination. So, of course, we can think that the Romulan army was pretty similar in essence, right? You have perhaps even a greater emphasis at that point on chariot warfare, cavalry warfare. We are in time, as you know, from the development of, say, the Bronze Age, etc., that in the end of the same, that at this point cavalry is really developing, right? It's really becoming, in the most advanced countries, under that point of view, the main mounted arm. Right, it's surpassing chariotry as much as also infantry is doing. Right, it depends on which peoples you're looking at, with more feudal, more nomadic, or more tribal character. This all intertwines. So that's again the reason why likely this Roman tradition doesn't remember chariot warfare, even though in this military organization, even though the entire Roman iconography is filled exclusively with this symbolism. For the entire history of Rome and beyond. So the thing is unequivocal, right, we find a lot of italic burials of horses, of chariots. We know perfectly well that was the deal. So we can imagine around a time like the 8th, the 7th century BC, again, still an altar elite of, say, heroes, say, champions, riding into battle on chariot and dismounting, because as we will see also Roman cavalry dismounts often, and I made a video about Roman archaic combat. I have something on it. If you check the Roman Warfare playlist, you will find the stuff. Also in the Cavalry Warfare playlist, you will surely find it. Remember to essentially moving fast on the battlefield, dismounting, joining forces, etc. This mostly because of the aforementioned bulkiness, let's say, of these Latin Italic infantries that were very tough, right, to break, also by this quite powerful horsemen, because you will see that, and also we know it archaeologically from the type of armor that still keeps on existing throughout up to the 5th century and beyond, that essentially, say, the hero, the champion, the top armor, right, that you could find around was designed for cavalry combat, right? It required a brutal level of athleticism, naturally performed in a feudal context, just like medieval knights, right? These people had owned a lot of land, a lot of people. This was before the Manipular Legion, and so also the opening of the people to the Imperium, fundamentally, as the plebs as magistrates conferred with the Imperium. And so the prevalence of a mounted shock force that was able, however, also to dismount, and this is quite composite glacial countryside, that really shows, like, again a clanic warfare of incredible violence. Think about the massacre of the Fabii at the Cremera. That was essentially a private war of this major Roman clan that, however, had avamposts further in the north, in the countryside, say, far from Rome, even though it's still comprehended by the suburban area today in these places, including Fidenna. In that case was a war against VIII, by the way. So something that tells you, like, the incredibly feudal, privatistic, elitistic sense of self-superiority of a stock, right, that is, again, brutally brought up just on this constant divine indoctrination regarding the fact that, of course, those who also, for example, fight on horseback are superior to the others, are people that have objectively, yes, compared to the infantrymen, a much higher level of professionalism, of, again, lifetime practice, this constant, and again, incredibly also traumatic selection, right, of being brought up. These people had to, from a quite early age, just being given their own retinues, going around the countryside, raping, pillaging, massacring in all the types and forms, deporting slaves, etc. And the entire point of the Roman elite was being made up like this, right? And this is something that, for this period, the one treated by today's video, is the sole identity of any true Roman, because the rest is not even thought to be technically something like that. It's just like the Middle Ages. Like, the commoners are just a sort of weird, fallen, inferior extension of just your own rule over them. Like, these people are essentially owned by others, like, just by sheer manifestation of again, of power, because they literally, again, lived on the lands of these people and so on. So, of course, the rise of Rome as a city brought to, especially during the Etruscan period, the instances of the plebs to bring eventually to the, and we explained this also in the very moment of the start of the Roman conquest of Italy, to the obvious realization, as it happens throughout, in fact, all the great advancements of Western civilization, this enlightened, powerful, competent elite that understands just that giving a chance of redemption to the lesser elements of society that can achieve the unthinkable, Rome, but even micro other mechanisms. Think about the Marius Mules, or I don't know, the Jeunesse Dorée with Napoleon, or more, right? That bring this incredibly powerful force to literally explode and take over everything through that oil mechanism. Naturally, these noblemen were masters of war. They were condottieri fundamentally, like in the academic language. That's how they are described properly, because they were, right. So in this phase of her development, Rome had to have the need to acquire the monopoly of the use of force by, first of all, acquiring an autonomous military force. Right? Rome was inhabited since like prehistory, but very much long ago. There are finds from, I don't know, the glacial era, etc. Of course, this place was already populated, an incredibly advantageous position, dominating the Tiber from these hilltops, right, all grouped together at the very center of the lower Tiber Valley, at the frontier with Etruria and other places at the mouth of the river that is close, in fact, maritime trade and so on. So an incredibly important center that, however, had to develop through in a time in which statualization wasn't quite there. Again, there were these many Latin cities in the surroundings that, again, just like in the Middle Ages, we're not really like, this is okay, a state and just, it's this city, it all functions in the same way, etc. No, it's just like a sort of lordship of the most powerful clans from one city or another that want to marry into each other, want to rule on this city at a time, and on this other, then so the others group to clash. It's a continuous bloodshed, a clash, toughening up, right? It's a militarized space, but it's also very rich, right? Because the land is quite fertile. There is, again, there are the salt mines, especially at the mouth of the Tiber. That's where also the cattle of the Apenninic neighbors goes to, like at some point in the markets, etc. It's really a central place. There are major structures that, for example, the sanctuary of Jupiter Lacharis. There is, again, this figure of Alba Longa that at some point is even superior and commanding Rome, in fact, from that top sense of, that was the Olympus of Rome, fundamentally, where Jupiter's was. And before Rome, I mean, of course, all these places had a temple to Jupiter, and so the one also of Optimus Maximus in Rome became the Olympus, together with the entire symbolism of the oak, just like the tree of God in the Bible, of the Yggdrasil in the Norse tradition. Then they believed the same, that was the Asgard of Rome, essentially, and the myth of the Gs, right, of Yuna, that save, in fact, as a typical of also of the Celtic mythology as an animal, and later on it represents. Think about the Lohengrin with the swan, this northern conquerors that arrived to take over and order everything, just like the Romans did in the Mediterranean, and with these figures that are represented even in the Arapakis Augusti to really symbolize this divine mandate, right, from Rome. So it's say not just the Arxis, the Sancta Sanctorum, of course, but again it's Rome herself in that symbol of power. So someone who is over the others, that rules in virtue of superiority, right? The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus is the one which still Publius Cornelius Scipio, before his last showdown with Hannibal, would go basically being inspired, having essentially divine visions in this magic era, because they thought that that's how close they were to God himself, and to say practice this ascetic experience, by the way, throughout the same rites that were carried out by the war bands initially in all their brutality, right? So the leitmotif, as we explained countless times, that was, however, an incredibly gradual process, was the affirmation of a Roman military, of a Roman army, let's say, that could be ever more centralized in control, right? So not just recruited and organized by private citizens, and this is technically what the Roman army always was, even throughout all the entire history. I mean, the senators that were the ones that led the entire thing, right? But it could rely, in fact, on a centralized command, administration, even if were collegial commands, and consulship and beyond, etc. You still have, of course, an incredible level of uniformation and collective discipline, etc. in the later centuries that stemmed from this incredible effort, again, of survival politically from the neighbors' attacks, and that revolved around this symbiosis, synergy, and synthesis of the patricians and the plebeians, the chosen elite descending from the gods. They all had their own sagas describing his families did, and these other people that were somehow connected, were the product of this fallen world, were in part also the demographic strength of Rome, and in fact, more connected to the Chthonic cults, while the senators were all about essentially heaven, etc. And of course, they were the one actually in command. But they could have not been successful without the people as well. This tension, as you know, was highlighted at the time of the Etruscan rule, because the Etruscans brought in some kind of more autocratic monarchy of sort, but there was then the Roman nobility and the people, and of course the monarch would try to favor the people to try to stem the power of the nobility. Eventually, this doesn't happen. Rome becomes what it is at the end of the Etruscan, so as we know her, at the end of the Etruscan period, because that monarchy fails, right? And remember some interesting parallelisms from a military point of view. In Greece, right, the entire Hellenic, this push of, of the demographic forces that force the charity, the aristocrats, the tyrants, to fall, right? And so what we know as classical Greece, as the phalanx of the expression of the citizenry there, was also actually the extreme of it, right? In Rome, this thing never happened. There's never been, for example, a democratic Rome. This literally never existed, right? Well, there was at some point a democratic Greece. It was also very different from the way we think democracy nowadays. And it was technically not democracy. Nobody called it in that sense, in that way. At least the demos at some point tried in the extremes to rule, but of course it was a complete failure still in what we call the democratic culture of Greece. Just like we call our own world democratic, it's evident, and thank God for that the majority of people, the demos, is actually it's like the plebs, it's a contemptuous term, just like human, which means dirty. Because all power comes from God, nothing else. Just a few people, the better ones, the more capable, the richer, the ones that have earned more, of course, have more power to rule. And this is the only possible way any system can work, right? So when I say we have to defend our democracy, I don't mean it. I know that democracy is a bad word, but it's actually the level of balance that we have achieved as the West, that people often self-sabotage in front of other peoples in the world that actually accomplish nothing better than we do, right? But obviously, especially the people from the crawling one, say, of populism, exactly does this self-sabotage. They would prefer the entire hierarchy to collapse because they are jealous of other people's accomplishments, right? So all successful civilizations instead were brought together by a very strong authority that used the people effectively, not making them even lower, because that eventually everything collapses. Look at totalitarianisms, that's the same way it happened, because the people were not enough. It was not the governments who were not enough, it was the people who were incapable of making anything about that, just as much as the people were the government were unable to do that. And Rome embodies, in fact, the opposite of this. Rome shows an incredible synergy again between, with an incredible moral force existing, this elite just being, again, according to the various legions, able to just by sheer fate to surpass the proof of fire against tyrants, and still being able to provide the plebs with that imperium that they evidently had deserved, thanks to the inspiration from this courageous leadership. So people becoming better, tending towards the elite, right, and becoming, in fact, as Romans, the people that takes over the other peoples of the world in the process, right? So it's of shocking beauty and marvel and wonder. Right? It's an incredibly inspiring system that has nothing to do with today's average person that should be just ashamed for anything, basically, what the world has become. Because of them, not because of some strange person in the Hyperuranium, right? The terrible rich people that do not know how the poor workers feel. Yeah, because, if the poor workers were intelligent, educated, and, actually capable people, right? There wouldn't be such gap. There wouldn't be such difference. Let's stop flattering ourselves, right? That's not how it works. The entire traditional world work in the diametrically opposite way. What the so-called saviors of our world against the terrible elite are exclusively whining about. That's exactly because they're the opposite of what these people were at the time. And the clash was intense. I mean, the capacity of putting the system together was tested dramatically, right? In the first centuries of Rome's life, there are frequent historical references to armies brought together by clans, the gentes in Latin, which comes from the same cauldron of genus, right, of genetic, of stock, like, again, it was meant dynastically, biologically, bloodly, right? These people were souls because they're, and that's why, this was not a Gnostic heresy, and tradition has nothing to do with Gnosticism, as some, alleged traditionalists delude themselves with, betraying their total ignorance in the most basic Indo-European tradition, religious tradition. These people were to transcend in the flesh, right? While Gnostics see the flesh as the creation of the devil, and so they basically start to think that everything that happens just happens by waiting for dying or mortifying yourself and not doing anything, because somebody will simply save you without doing anything after you die. And that you have just to realize this and abandoning this world without doing anything. This thing was based solely, of course, on action. And so on the perfect realization that spirit had the capacity of transcending flesh, and that both are needed in order to make the totality of the world coming back to the one. Otherwise, you believe that there is just an evil god and a bad god. There's no such thing in tradition. There's only an unaccomplished divinity as long as mankind is not able to come back to it. And the rest is nothingness. There is not an evil god. Right, there are this disgusting thing you find, especially in conservatives nowadays. Everybody talking about, with exorcists, because you want to fuel your sectarian cosplaying that you think religion actually is. There's no such thing like the devil. It's not like hell. It's a non-place. Yes, you will be devoured according to these people, by the peoples of the underworld, right? The plebs were scared the hell by this. The Etruscan religion was lunar, telluric, and already lost to the Pelasgian degeneration. Thought of that, if you look at the Etruscan art, is incredibly dark, right? All these people swallowed by the deities of the underworld, people were scared, etc. Romanity was instead the diametrically opposite of this, was the fides, the sense of, do you know what fate actually means? Right? Do you know what it means in the language of traditional transcendence? These people believed that just by wanting and by not having any fear of anything, it was just a self-limitation of the divine being, you could achieve all. right? This is the saying of the Roman noble, in fact, Gaius Mucius Scaevola, that put his hand on fire because he knew he wouldn't be touched by that if sheer will to power had wanted that in front of the Etruscan king Porsenna, right? That instead was to be naturally shocked by this and revealed in his inferiority as in that lack of trust in the possibility of transcendence that the Etruscans had almost missed. There are actually Uranian elements in every religion, right? But dramatically imbalanced in the incredibly dark, grotesque, obscure, nocturnal Etruscan one compared to the complete and shining sun, right? Like it's just the symbol of the axis, the symbol of course of Jupiter's thunder, like in Thor's thunder slash hammer, right? And this all figuring prominently in the very essence of Romanity, right? This is where these people come from. The clash between this noble families that were this hardcore in terms of, having it, right? And who on their own initiative started wars or were appointed by the Senate to put an end to them, etc., or had to guard a strategic objective for periods of prohibited times for the normal Roman militia farmer, right, linked to the seasonality of agricultural work, is a bit the dilemma here, because the sense was that, and you see it in the Roman sagas. I made that video about the Battle of Suez explaining it, right, with the consul that puts to death his own son, not because he hadn't been virtuous, he had actually defeated a Latin horseman in combat and had brought back the spolia. That is essentially the vestige of the human sacrifice. Again, the way of the left hand, what we were saying before, that every Roman must carry out in order to achieve certain places. But he had disagreed. His father's consul of Rome order not to engage in that thing for a higher wisdom, a higher knowledge, something, in fact, it corresponds a bit to, in the warband, to the idea of the senior, the idea of, again, Odin's, for example, wisdom, the sense that he's an old-aged man that sees more than you do, even as a young hero, right, loaded in testosterone, etc. That's not what actually makes the thing, right? Barbarians are actually like that. In fact, all the even the Aesir, etc., are just like the Romans against the Gauls in the stories, are always smaller than the opponent. Like that, aside from the differences between, let's say, Europeans in height that were actually quite close to one another, and especially when the Romans selected their youths to go at war later on, it were often taller than the average warrior that normally was, say, the average also peasant that was mobilized from the other side in a non-professional army, right, was actually thrown around by the same Romans. They wanted to stress the fact that they were shorter, they were smaller, and these were bigger chthonic barbarians emerged from the dirt of the earth, and that were big but stupid. You find it in Norse mythology as well. We find it, of course, in all the monsters against which the Olympians fight in the Dorian mythology. So, of course, there was a mix between the two things, because you can imagine that this noble stocks being also more traumatically selected, so to be of some sort of more robust stock even. There is an impressive amount, for example, of Roman onomastics referring to blonde hair, red hair, blue eyes, etc. I will make a video about this, because whatever was the level of dilution of the Indo-European conquerors in the Italian peninsula, they had maintained the sense that those were the people with those characteristics that were closer to the gods, in their own sense that they were closer to the awareness of the sacred in their hearts. So through war and through all this holy fight that we have described, and that thus highlighted also the fact that there was, as we've seen with the term gentes itself, gens singular, a genetic continuity that was thought throughout all these religions to have a lot to do actually with certain characters you would bring with yourself, including the fact that there was, again, more to, say, the bulkier you were, in a sense, the more physical you were, the stronger, the more intense you were, that you also, the greater the nerves you had to control your force and to exert it as the best one, which was actually even a greater challenge than someone who was more pressured. So you would always incur in the risk of becoming you the stupid barbarian, as opposed to whoever was. Because it was never lower the guard, right? And so know that these characteristics, these phenotypes, essentially were connected to those peoples that we all speak the language of, even though that we're not necessarily descended from in a consistent fashion, or and that we speak the language of, we have the religions, the beliefs of, etc., and that Rome was rebooting to take over basically all the other peoples that had fallen to that lower standards in virtue of this belief. Now this is very powerful. And the risk that I was highlighting here is exemplified by the sense of Romanity as a sole rule, right? The idea that there must be, etc., kings are dangerous in some way. Of course, Romulus is the first king. So kingship does exist in the Indo-European, fully Indo-European sense of warrior and priest, in a sense. There are debates regarding how the tripartite order really functioned. There are some issues here, but things could be, let's say, just, it doesn't mean that there was a tripartite function, that this could not be summed up by the same individual, right? This is actually, on the contrary, the very meaning of the Trinity per se, both in von Clausewitz and in the Indo-European belief. But again, the concept, in fact, of having lost a single leader, right? The history of the Roman monarchy as the one of a constant degeneration, up to the point the nobles said, okay, we need to get rid of these guys. It's not an achievement. It's not an accomplishment. Just like the democratization of a process, it simply means that humanity degenerates, and all peoples at the time believed that this was the case. That there were various ages of. Here we were essentially at the end of the Bronze one, and so we still are in the following Iron one. But let's say this democratization of power is not much an achievement, together with the rationalization, etc., but just a way that we try to make up for our fallen kind that is more fallen than before. And so that we have to make up for, in order to make things work, to increase, in fact, the collective training and being able to impose that kind of potential that at the time was, as we've seen, much more intrinsic in people. This was the idea, because they were less distant from the foe than we are 2,500 years later, or more even, this case. And so you don't have even traditionally to confuse modernity with an antithesis of tradition. I made a video specifically about this topic, that is the one about the French Revolution, that is always about the following. Who has the power? Whoever has power because God gave him. So whoever succeeds in something is succeeding because of a virtue. Like, it couldn't be conceived otherwise, right? There is not like the evil guy who has a lot of power but no virtue or capacity. It can't happen. Right? Just you have to see what ultimately happens to him. And in fact, the Romans were incredibly, while the Greeks had already somehow a much more secularized and rationalized way of seeing death as a sort of generic thing that accommodates people, etc. Instead, the Romans were incredibly focused on the way people died, especially their last words and how they died for, because this was meant to highlight essentially what this person had failed in transfiguration for, And so what kind of a lesson was to be drawn from that, and also what kind of stock were his children? The Romans were fixated with this. Like, probably nobody told you that this was what Romanity was substantiated with, because again, we have been told, for obvious reasons, I would say, a completely different story. But if this is what we saw just from much better documented time, you can imagine what was happening half a millennium before. In an unspeakably violent world, like nothing you could see at a generalized level within the Roman citizenry, like later on, right? A warrioristic, militaristic reality, then of course was also overall weaker, had yet to become the Roman Empire, but that emerged from this combination force that we're addressing. Now, these Roman private armies, again, the ones belonging to the clans of the various patrician houses, are witnessed, of course, even in the Republican period. One of the oldest Latin inscriptions, datable around the end of the 6th century, known as the Stone of Satricum, that was found at Ferriere di Conca in the Pontine countryside south of Rome, says, quote, "Here the comrades in Mars posed of Publius Valerius." This is just like a little brick, fundamentally. I don't know if you ever watched it. I inserted here in the picture at some point. This is one of the first attestations of Latin, by the way, because which was a much more, of course, primitive, clear-cut, somehow very effective, semantically deep language at point, and of course refers to a war band. Right here, it's interestingly also, it's Latin, but it's still, of course, similar to the Italic. Mars is in the Mamers form, like the Mamertines, right? These were all essentially Indo-European war bands, a community of warrior that in this case was celebrating the memory of their leader, perhaps the same Publius Valerius Publicola, who was among, according to legend, the founders of the so-called Roman, say, Republic. We'll also have to explain at some point, because it's mostly made up conceptually, but of course there was an important watershed. But what is important here is that you realize that here we're talking about the very top of the Roman leadership, and you realize that these people themselves were still at the time conceived as part of the migrating war band, right? In this world that is a sort again of a metaphysical accident due to the sin of mankind to have incarnated the sky vault because of having forgotten, say, having thought that they could fear and they could die, other than concentrating on divine perfection, and so causing the earth, the world, and so this guy is wandering around it, trying to find a way to make it return to its primal state. Right, so when you read the Mamertines, the first Punic Wars, that are just know that those were other people compared to the Romans, but that so alive, still by that point, that bondage, that sense of, that incredibly primitive sense of camaraderie, right, just because of the style of these essentially mercenary groups at that point, rather, was so deeply imbued, right, in the Italic culture, that was, again, we praise for, again, the development, eventually the civilized aspects, etc. It's just like Greece, right? We don't think much about the Dorians and what they brought as a concept, what geometric painting, for example, means in terms of that purity of action and principle and divine geometric order, etc. We just like the later stuff. We like Pompeii, we like, I don't know, Hellenic philosophy, but that's all a later aspect of classical civilization. It has given its fruits because it stems from an incredible abundance of achievement, etc. But that is the only thing that we have essentially identified those cultures like, as if they had always been like that or had emerged somehow in a meaningless or accidental way, while their entire point of their success was due to that primal belief, right? So as we were saying before, the archaic armies, but not only the ones in Rome, that this is valid for the entire Latium, this is valid for the Oscans, for many other tribes out there. To remember, there are at some point even the Celts in the north that bring a bit even more of that sort of even more primitive Indo-European element to it, formed a bond with their leader, similarly to the feudal one of medieval knights. Right? And also the combat tactics could not have been very different as a consequence. So I pass to the fight here, because of course we have we have mostly the Roman sagas, and through again the later authors that told us those stories that were incredibly again specific in their original meaning. And unfortunately we know very few about the original texts, wherever they found the stuff. Of course Livy, Varra, Virgil had much kind of closer distance, culturally, chronologically, personally, to those sources than we did, right? If you I was reading the Aeneid the other day. If you look at the passage on the death of Turnus, you see there the entire thing. There is the victory that doesn't transport him on the chariot, that is not going to come pick him on the chariot anymore. There is the entire reference of the scene is pure, if not just only Indo-European, because there were other peoples who believed a bit the same thing. Still the most unequivocally imperial universal symbolism that stems right from this more archaic times. Right? They were completely aware of this stuff. Just they wouldn't write in a way that had needed, of course, to explain people that were studying this stuff 2,000 years later what it would mean, because to them the meaning was so obvious that there was no even purpose in explaining it, because everybody realized what the thing really was. It was not a form of classicism or a literary elitism. You could ask even a guy from the Subura that he would have known that. He would have probably added a lot of profanities in terms of much more cultic, say, chthonic, physical, somehow, in fact, squalidly popular element. But the meaning that these guys were at the top and that fought in that way, and those were the heroes, and everybody kind of liked them. And because in a sense they all belonged to their clientele and depended on their success, shared and testified to, and we're all again one with the entire cults as well, because they were like, even in their deities, in the more plebeian ones, more agricultural, fertile ones that were thought to be under the ones of heaven, etc. Still, there was a dual symbol. There was a connection between the two things, as much as there was between the Romans and the Sabines, for example, after the rape. Like the Roman people had been born out of that. So it was seen as the same universal order. And it was important to feel the tension inherent between the two things in order to have that bond, that connection, that solidity. So the commander, or the clan chief at this point, gathered around him naturally his own family members and clients, that is, people with whom he had close friendship, economic and political ties. This is notorious to any anthropologist and military historians as far as tribal warfare goes, right? These people were the closest, were part of the same stock. They literally in the flesh embodied like a soul force, right? This is often stressed even in some sort of mythology, that we've seen it in the Gaelic Fiannas, etc. The idea that an enemy that is especially very it's like this monster is also in the Hellenic tradition, in the Titans, etc. They have enormous. They are many. They have multiple heads, arms. These are enemy formations, right? They refer to the strength, the physical strength of these enemies that has to be beaten from a spiritual point of view, right? So this thick compaction of the units formed sort of wedges, as we'll see now. These people fought all together at the center of the formation. Needless to say, the leader was to be the strongest one. There was no such thing like, if somebody is stronger than you, it takes orders from you. Doesn't make any sense. It's dangerous. It's a dysfunctional system, and so you couldn't be less than your retinue, but your retinue could not be less than you. This is remarked also for other peoples by, for example, by Caesar, by Tacitus. Think about the Germans. The Romans were projecting on them all the archaic values that they had shared and that they saw in them in a much later time than this, recalling, being aware of them. So there was a harder core made up by the actual family that again was thought to be the most important connection, actually being of the same blood. Is the closest, it's the most important thing of all, because again it's believed that gens is made up of that same flesh of the same blood. You can't quite simply belong to somebody else unless, of course, this power is so great that you can be adopted. This is normal, for example, in the later Roman world. It was meant, of course, at some of the highest levels of spiritual elevation. Think about Caesar and Octavian, right, as father and son by adoption. This had a meaning that went beyond, like, for the average person. The sense of the proximity of blood was crucial. These connections, and of course, also in that case, of course, Caesar and Octavian had shared part of the same blood, and it was important to bond on that base as well. Otherwise, it would have not had meaning either, right? These troops were the finest. They were the richest, the most powerful, the ones who had, again, more resources to fight for a lifetime, could literally win their own equipment, stripping it from the enemies. This polyoptimize, again, as we were like a bit in the Iliad, you realize that the corpse of the enemy is a trophy in of itself, right? There is a power intrinsic into it. I mean, the later drinking into an enemy's skull, for example, is or severing his hand. Still, it's all connected with a lot in Celtic or in Germanic or Hunnic practices, etc. This was completely normal. It had a very specific meaning, first, that you would gather the talismanic power of this person on you, right? That once you killed them, you essentially swallowed this power and became more powerful yourself. That's why you also had to kill. Again, in the Holy War, as a sort of sacrifice, these forces, because you would have not been evaluated enough if you hadn't been so. You had at times to literally take the place of the guy that you killed by saying, being adopted by his father. We have seen it, for example, in the Longobards tradition, right? Audoin has to kill the king of the Gepids and the king of the Gepids' son, and his father accepts him as his. The Gepid king as his adoptive son, and only at that point Alboin can go back to his father Audoin, king of the Longobards, and being accepted at his table. So that's also how brutal and somehow cold and incredibly patriarchal the system was. You could not be... say the father had a power of recognizing, not recognizing the son spiritually, right? the weaker children, as you know, were thrown off the Tarpeian rock, right? Just because they were thought to be genetically adequate. Saying, go think about the Spartans, they get us mountain, etc. This is incredibly crude and terrifying, etc. But to them, like, the interesting thing is that they did it not just for some sort of superstition, but because to some degree it had actually been working in terms of biological selection for what these people had to do in their everyday life. They're also very often brutally short-lived, because this was just like, think about like a mob war. Right, this is how these clans actually behave. This is what feudalism fundamentally is before the modern state. Like, the mafia actually rules the world in this incredibly vicious and unpredictable and conflictual way, and bloody way especially. So all these people had to be that tough in order to even be accepted, as we've seen in these formations. They were conceived as an elite one. It was again this would be maintained in the Roman tradition, in freedom, in full Roman citizenry, the idea not just of superiority of the other peoples, but the actual nobility in front of God. Right? Still, it was an approximation, because no, say, Roman citizen was actually really equal to another in a spiritual sense. Right? Legally, there was this standardization because it was an advanced society. They needed some regulation of that kind, but still, of course, like, if you were more powerful, you were more important than another. Yet, the Roman citizen was the one who could bear the cingulum militaris, or at least that could become a soldier, because he had earned that as the fruit of such progeny of world conquerors, and it all stemmed from this original thought. I explained this thing, especially as far as the how many Roman citizens were created, of course, through manumission during the Roman conquest of Italy, in that sense of redemption. Rome was thought there to inject you with this spiritual superiority, would, through the power of these people, transcend part of your own nature as well, if you, of course, were able to meet the criteria, the standards of this Romanity, right? The Italic peoples paid an incredible tribute of blood, not just fighting against Rome, but also for Rome. But to do what? To achieve that level of Romanity, because they knew at that point they would have dominated the world just by being within that. This is incredibly crucial to understand the entire Roman history. Like, this is arguably the single most important thing that every person should know since childhood. It doesn't matter how brutal it sounds, but in terms of what is Rome, basically the first thing is this. It's not the empire from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. It's not the Colosseum. It's not the aqueducts. It's not the roads. It's this, right? The traditional meaning of Romanity. That, remarkably enough, also nobody knows, or at least nobody conceptualizes to the extent of actually seeing through all these connections on a regular basis, compared to all the other aspects of Romanity that we're looking at. So there was a huge deal of heroic warfare. This was normal at the time. I will explain heroic warfare in a separated video for the sake of course, explaining that there was never historically like just a matter settled by two guys and that's it. But it was a romantic view, because again, these guys, if their honor was so high, they would higher the stake to the degree they controlled the rest of what they were betting on, right? So namely, think about the Roman army. There is Rome herself. We know of this stuff until very late in time. If you look at the accounts, for example, of the Battle of Sentinum, the story of the wolf that runs in front of the Roman host, as opposed to the hare, if I'm not wrong, from the other side of the enemies, Italian enemies of Rome. that is harmonized literally like this is an omen, because of course this is the Roman wolf, the wolf of Mars, etc. But what actually it seems to mean is that these were actual champions that were making evolutions and combat and duels in front of the battle lines before the actual clash began. And this was normal in other cultures as well. So for the youth, if you look at the Roman Velites, for example, like they had their stereotypically the wolf head, etc., because those were thought to be, again, still in the idea of the Roman army as a whole, as a war band, the youthful element that was at the lowest level of animal beast-like level. I made just a video about the Ulfednars and Berserkers, explaining this also in the development of the Viking military, the Scandinavian military, that had to test themselves in that sort of crazed way in front of the lines as youthful, elastic, sort of, again, foolish, not wise enough warriors that, however, would already arrange through the some forces would unleash the direction this combat would have gone. Initially, it was truly a matter of combat. The Romans were fixated with single combat, right? In all their sagas, you find always this thing going on. The Roman, as such, is about this. If you wonder why, for example, the Romans built amphitheaters everywhere, but just in the mostly in the western half of their empires, because that's where they went colonizing the most. And everywhere there was a Roman colony, there had to be an amphitheater to remind that Roman citizen that the most important thing to them was duels as warriors, being habituated to bloodshed, being in that state of mind, right? This is not a sort of strange taste for combat that we could have still today in some sports, etc. This is literally the fact that bloodshed through combat was the hallmark of Romanity in absolute terms, because it really remembered, again, the fasces that cut the deer, right, from the mists of Proto-Indo-European world, and they had to partake that. So here, of course, we should digress if we were making an exquisitely tactical analysis of this, say, of this engagement, but we're talking about Roman archaic warfare, generally speaking. So that there is a dimension which, again, like in the progression of the Berserkers and the Ulfednars, first there was a time, the more archaic one, in which these guys were the actual, not the leaders of the armies, but at least the spearhead, the best ones. There is a time in which instead they're just, again, crazy vagabonds, homeless outlaws, right? That's it. And so the idea that, of course, the Velites too, embodying this last example of, relatively humiliating condition compared to the other, because they were not technically even part of a true class, right? Consider other peoples normally used serfs rather than actual Roman citizens like the Velites actually were. So that tells you also the much about the level of Roman militarization in these archaic times to still have that so prominently included in Romanity. In any case, the primal archaic meaning, again, is that the more loaded these individuals were, right, the more this warfare was tribal, and so about individualism as opposed to collective training, these leaders and their closest elements would guide their actions on the front line, right? Flanked by, of course, their own more valiant and experienced companions, personal insignia, right? Much of what you see systematized as eventually the eagle, but also other animals before Marius that still were employed frequently, stamped from this totemic symbolism of who these persons were, what kind of animals they had chosen, or other symbols, because that corresponded, again, also to the somatic degree that their genes had transformed into. Like they were during the fall of mankind. These branches had all fallen in different ways, so they had different symbols that were not even a matter of personal customization, but they had really been attributed at some point, where you could not deny that, for example, an ancestral archetypal meaning of certain animal or object, whatever, reflected, for example, a sort of hierarchy within this imagery, right? That you had, that were reflected by your gens, and so also by the stories concerning which gods they descended from, etc. Of course, the value of these insignia was both military and mystical, and this remained in the Roman army throughout its entire history, just like any banner up to now, where it's loaded, naturally much less today, with this sort of a deeper meaning, something that transcends, in fact, the importance of the individual life. The banner is more important than the individual soldier of the unit that bears it, of course, because the understanding, especially in the military, that, of course, human life is not the most important thing, and that there is, in fact, something more transcendental, as far as the divine, at the end of the day, really is, even though we're secularized, get prone to atheism, and so on. And even contraposing such symbols to the actual meaning, it's still actually the reminiscence of that meaning. That's very interesting, right? And especially in the military, there is a very specific reason. Remember, holy war, holy combat, sacrifice, self-sacrifice. That's it. You don't find it in any other, concretely, in any concretely carried out in any other branch of society, right? And that's why, in fact, in these cultures, the army was not just the most functional branch of society, but also the most important one in general. The various contingents of troops marched in rows and lined up in battle against each other, maintaining the most orderly formation possible. I will make a video next that will explain how the Romans actually adopted what was known as tactics. I'm speaking Hellenic here, meaning that very often people think that the Romans just copied stuff from everybody around, and that this somehow means that they didn't have a culture or something, except every other people did the same thing. And of course, actually doing this successfully means that you're far more advanced than the other cultures, even in the moment in which they are superior to you in other ways. In fact, we tend to underestimate this aspect of advancement even by relatively primitive people. Of course, there is a level of development there that must be accomplished, but it's about mental forms, right, that makes a different levels with the material side of the story, right? As we were saying before, in the 3rd century BC, still Roman culture, and I made a video about just the 2nd century BC, the Roman destruction of Carthage and Corinth, highlighting that for the actual political debate and cultural instances of that frangent. An incredibly primitive, brutal, and rough people. But they could literally put up together a fleet and defeating the Carthaginians at sea. So the myth that the Romans also were somehow often told that they were less technologically advanced than up to a certain point. And only in certain things, definitely, like in that regard. Then there are the technologistic prejudices too that do not help, but just to render you an example. Like, why was that? Because, Romans were scientists or technologists? No, they thought that was a degenerate, depraved, effeminate thing to be a contemplative scientist, as opposed to a Roman hero. But the point is still that, for example, the Celts could not achieve that at the same time by still being a very brutally primitive, warrioristic society. So as I was saying before, there was a modern, a specific balance between modernity and tradition. Whereas the average underschooled person today thinks that there is essentially a conspiracy theory that somebody cancelled history to make you think that a people was more or less advanced than another because they had this or that technology, and that had to reflect a standard level of development for which, I don't know, the Romans stole from everybody and they were, other peoples were in the third millennium and the Romans obscured that. This happens continuously, and you wonder why. The level of IQ is actually reversing, and people are prone to populism because they literally do not understand anything anymore about literally nothing about the fundamentals of politics, war, and society, and they try to apply it disastrously to their quite insultingly childish level of historical or lack of historical knowledge by any trace. But this is the reality in which we live. Now, the Romans, as I was saying, at some point did have to provide themselves with a military discipline and order that, of course, only at some point in the development of warfare is received, at least to a certain degree. Right? It's unfair. Lots of people, and I made lots of videos to debunk this because it's been soundly debunked by the entire historiography on the topic. Of course, for example, didn't copy at all the hoplitic phalanx. There was never such a thing in the Italic interland, such an hoplitic phalanx. It didn't work. At best, it was just some Hellenic arms and armor boat. Just as you see here, even among the Etruscans, there are those beautiful arms and armor on the chariot of Monteleone. You find, by the way, Achilles depicted. The Etruscans were fond of this stuff, and that was kind of universal knowledge also because the archetypal meaning of the hero there, and the American hero, was pretty much shared by this entire system. I'm referring to a specific level of collective training, order, alignment, etc., that is to be essentially at some point received, standardized, and in fact, infused in the army. And there was a point in which this happened, but it had nothing to do with hoplitism. It had nothing to do with, say, the copy, for example, of a Greek model. I remember the endless debates at some point with legitimately, even relatively smart adults on Facebook history groups. There was no way to explain them that, for example, the Romans created the Manipular Legion for reasons that had nothing to do with any Hellenic influence. At the time, they weren't even fighting against the Greeks. It had nothing to do with that. It was not a formation or an army designed, generally speaking, to cope with, say, a Macedonian phalanx as opposed to a Gallic host. Right? If anything, it was mostly for the latter or other Italic people. But they don't understand that there's nothing mechanistic about it. They weren't trying to find the ways to win because they were, using a gladius and a scutum and a couple of pila as opposed to a sarissa. And in different, they weren't reasoning like that. They had what they had because their society evolved that way. And yes, also in part of some military input, but at that point, literally having nothing to do with that, with those other military models, except the general sense, again, of order, of things like alignment, on how to maintain mostly order during the maneuvers, etc. This was the thing. It was also a relatively big deal. I mean, it's not until the Second Punic War, for example, the Manipular Legion acquires the capacity to, for example, change in front, right, of the maniples, wheeling about, doing something like that, because they didn't have the training. There was still an army crudely conceived for frontal attack, and mostly the use of reserves in the triplex Achaeus. That was the entire point. It mostly stemmed from the idea that the single battle line is simpler, however, is also gives you less option, as they found out the hard way at the Allia River. So this has nothing to do with, especially weaponry. Weaponry is bent to tactics, not the other way around, or at least if it happens in the other way around to a degree that is by definition not even close to of course the 50% plus 1. It's minimal. So we will learn how that happened, and the reason why we're talking about this, by the way, is that it's yet again the same Romans that threw this myth around. Like most myths that we criticize, that again, uneducated people criticize the Romans for, are actually things that the Romans threw around to actually qualify themselves, because they were good at it, even though the thing didn't quite happen so mechanically as the later historiography was describing. So again, the diametrically opposite was true. And in that sense, again, the Romans realized that they had acquired a sense of order, of discipline, of alignment, etc., through a type of warfare that was in fact more collectively developed, like the one was happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the military system that they developed, for that matter, was probably the most unique of them all, in spite of being not, in fact, concretely different in a material sense from the one of other peoples. It was still about heavy infantry, like basically the entirety of the European continent, except that heavy infantry managing to do certain things, and not because of weapons, they just adapted to those things that were to be done, but because there was a moral force, a personal quality, a cultural background that other peoples did not have, and that lays mostly its roots in religion. Right? Then you can say that Romans were blessed by their location, whatever, but believe me, there were much better ones in other ways, and politics is not made by geography, even in that case, if not by a minimal degree, right? Just for those who think that geopolitics exists as a real thing. This is very important to stress, and I say this because maintaining order was a challenge for this early Roman tribal armies. The various contingents of troops essentially marched in rows and lined up in battle alongside each other, maintaining the most orderly formation possible. This is, in many ways, just like, I don't know, a Celtic army fought, like, at the time. Right? Italic warfare was importantly advanced by this point. As I was saying before, the Celts did surely influence this system, but they were still broader part of the Central European, continental European military development, and actually Italy was already much more advanced under many points of view. So again, more concentrating more on the individualistic level doesn't mean to be more advanced. It's the contrary. Right, that's what you must use in order to make up for the lack of a collective quality. So the degree by which eventually this would turn into something like we will see in the 4th century with the genesis of manipular religion, etc., is that long. It's these centuries long, in fact. And so initially you would see something much more also probably undistinctive about Romano-Italic and Italian warfare in general. I mean, just this, again, like during the Bronze Age, this warriors and chariots with already some consistent cavalry and infantry following in for the majority of sanitary peoples, and that's pretty much it. Some lighter troops to skirmish, harass the enemy, and these heroes covered in bronze, like as the essentially demigods that were taking the field to unleash this clash against titans, at least from their single perspective. So given that infantry because we don't have on the base of the Roman sagas and also the general archaeological background an evidence at some point that cavalry was decisive. Right, at this point, consider that cavalry was also not particularly developed in the first place, unless you count chariotry. But again, Italy was not exactly the best country for chariotry. Plus, again, it was mostly about the fact that its society was much less stratified. So there was a poorer elite that was closer to the bulk of the people, and so the people mostly fighting on foot. But still with important mounted contingent, so you would never see, like, I don't know, the Battle of Kadesh, happening. They didn't have, of course, the power of that kind, but they didn't have properly the doctrine, the level of habit of fielding large amounts of chariots, etc. Needless to say, however, since the communities were smaller, there was also probably a high level of impact, a higher level of impact of this cavalry. You see, as I explained from the Clausewitzian series, when, let's say, the larger the armies are and the more balanced the odds really are, which means that the outcome is also more predictable and usually not being dramatically far from a draw. When you get into smaller clashes, you start seeing things like, I don't know, one guy killing other 10, right? The smaller, it doesn't happen too often, but it still happens way more often than in larger engagements proportionally. So when you have such an incredible ethos placed by iconography, morals, just the sheer, evidence of this work, like on individual militarism and so on, you realize that a chariot tier, a horseman, etc., is something that really shocks more in relative terms than, let's say, the individual chariot in a much more, again, standardized tactics that, in fact, is also more functional to the collective dimension than the individual one. So we have really to appreciate the unspeakable level of athleticism of these warriors, especially the elite ones, right? So this were something that I will not even venture in describing, because it seems to me I would have to use a too excessive language to properly convey at least a part of what it could be like. And I think, despite the fact that usually my phrases are relatively controversial, this would exceed, the average precarious balance, let's say. In any case, as you understand, the cohesion of the formation was understood as the main thing, right? Even though there wasn't, you see the problem, there wasn't at this point a sole ruler that could impose, like a state or whatever, that level of rigid, brutal discipline that forced everybody to line up well, etc. This would all together, they were all different clans acting politically in a different way, consequently being on their own out there. This is just like we described this in, 6th century Germanic armies. Read the Strategicon of the Pseudo Mauritius about the blonde-haired people. You will find essentially a bit the same thing. This hyper-moral load, but fundamentally poor tactics. That's still a very important indicator, right? In the attack, the Roman units spontaneously took the formation of a wedge, led by a leader. This doesn't mean that the so-called pig snout formation was a real thing also in later times. Of course, again, the smaller the units are, the more you can place everything on the single guy that kind of breaks through, because he has an animal-like force and smashes into everything, shields people, etc., and chops everything to pieces. This is a thing, but whenever you have an orderly, rational kind of level, primitive discipline, you realize that the wedge formation is nothing but essentially the unit itself, right? You have this single battle lines that were already precariously put together and synchronized accordingly, where basically, again, this battle lines would clash against one another and go back and forth. Like, notoriously, combat lasts very few because it is exhausting, especially if you're covered in bronze. You have literally your senses obscured. You're basically always to pass out in the process, and so this thing can go on for an entire day, and it's extenuating, to say the least. But at some point, the enemy is worn out, and one of the clans that form the various sections of the line at some point will say, okay, these guys in front of us are broken, let's push through. And so these guys launch themselves, at that point just crushing the enemy for the sheer will to power, because you have been fighting all the day long. If you still have the force to launch a charge successfully, means that you are god, really. That's why they were also, that convinced of this, and that was the wedge, right? It means that the clan next to them would follow them, for example, because they were inspired by them. They would fall behind. There was a huge competition, as you understand, and so the formation at that point would look like a wedge, but it wasn't like a wedge, because there is nothing more nonsensical than, say, throwing your best man separated from everybody in a literal wedge formation against people that throw loads of javelins, stones, axes at you, and just being the first useful target that is supposed eventually to break through is the head of a clan, whatever. Yes, they did these things, don't get me wrong, these things did happen, but generally speaking, it was still something more, say, collective than we think overall, right? This is very important to stress. And this mostly in attack, as you understand. In defense, everything was different because, let's say, during prolonged fighting, the units aligned just as spontaneously. So each warrior's flanks were protected by a comrade, but this means that you're also essentially giving the initiative to the enemy. So you're not in a better position. Just you're awaiting for the enemy to wear out, to counterattack, and bring in this whole. The archaeological finds suggest that the main weapon of the warriors of this era was a spear with a massive point, right? Something that had to. It was very complex to wield, by the way. It had suggests a very individualistic type of fencing, by the way, even within the formation, of course. Also, the Celts had basically the same. So again, they were actually pretty similar, just like the evolution of javelins, swords, axes. People again think the Romans copied stuff from out. They were identical already, right? They just brought at some point some designs in later on because they could standardize the thing on the base of what they thought was more functional to a tactic that they developed, etc. This has nothing to do with the Romans having to copy weapons from others because they didn't have the same exact weapons, right? And pretty much the entire panoply is italic, like contrarily to what most people believe. The pilum is italic. The gladius, at least the type of swords that were used, were still pretty much universal in Mediterranean at the time. The scutum was italic as well. And the fact that they were similar to other peoples, again, doesn't mean that they copied. It means that they were just what was there, and they used by themselves like others did in the same identical way. So the spear is the thing for the average rank and file, who can so say Roman warrior at this point. In some cases, almost a sword with a handle, but javelins, swords, axes have also been found, while as protective armament, of course, we have metal breastplates, helmets, various shapes, oval or circular shields, etc. Naturally, this panoply could vary importantly. Battle axes, for example, were a thing in this type of warfare, which also suggests that level of anti-armor need for better troops, mostly. Everything would seem extremely primitive to our eyes. Made multiple videos about Bronze Age warfare, realized the extreme material poverty of even the single most advanced militaries existing. But to them, already having again a helmet or a breastplate was a huge deal, right? So you can imagine people covered in bronze. Like, these people were really gods in many ways. So given the prevalence of the aforementioned type of spear that is unsuitable to be thrown, there were javelins, but I made a video about the 4th century Italic javelins and how essentially the pilum evolved for collective tactics that the Romans had developed only at that point. At this point, you had most of this massive spear and then other lighter javelins, and mostly something just hybridizing eventually out of it, and also for different use. By the way, different range, for example, be thrown, but that again belongs to the history of the pilum later on. So this massive spear, as we pointed out, was meant for the warrior to fight individually, right? With a fencing made of continuous back and forth movements to place a larger move away from the opponent, right? And it was heavy stuff, right? Spears are really something, and they were, of course, the basic weapon of the time. The reason also why the Romans abandoned the spear as opposed to most of their opponents later on, first of all, is a bit overrated. I mean, the Romans did keep using the spear, actually, also throughout all their history, and not just the auxiliaries, etc., also the legionnaires. But the fact that it would pass preferably to the sword had to do still with the tactical, say, with the collective tactics they developed, and so the idea of disrupting this sort of battle line and passing directly to the swords in that brutal way, skipping all this spear fencing in between. And this could be achieved only with, again, a traumatically intensive level of collective training. In fact, most people did not have in that way. They could be very good individual fighters, but against collective training, that does not hold, right? And of course, the Romans fought with lots of auxiliaries that were equipped just in other ways, and again, they used spears really throughout their entire history on foot among the citizenry as well. This massive spear, by the way, entails an enormous individual training, and as heavy infantry, it partly reduces the capacity to be lighter in a way. So there would be, of course, a segmentation of the troops on the basis of this heavier, lighter equipment. The important thing, though, is that so early in time, such a primitive culture, you could have a combination of this sort of massive weapons with still a greater proclivity to employ other secondary ones, right? It's a bit like we have seen in the steppes, that the first sort of heroic Saka capacity was to both, charge with the Contus and using the bow, while the more softened up, relaxed Sasanians that were still a hell of a military later on had distinguished the two functions into different tactical forces. So a bit the same can be said for this early Roman of an army. It's a bit something you see also when the Romans invade Spain, that there are some Celtiberian forces that are really heavy and good and have these massive weapons, etc. But while very good at guerrilla, however, they weren't evaluated very much by the Romans in open field, right? But Scipio Africanus says, right? So the thing here is always comparing the say this feats, this greatness, this quality, this force individually, still as a failure of a more collective accomplishment, right? So this is something, at least in a material sense, the capacity of crushing another enemy, right? If Alexander the Great had invaded Italy in the 4th century BC, likely nobody would have really stopped him, right? And we understand, in a sense, why. But you gotta appreciate still what now these forces were doing, because there was some, of course, deep organization. The lines of formation had to be spaced apart in depth to provide the necessary space. This was understood, and as the front line fought, the following lines contributed by throwing, urging, aiding the wounded, replacing casualties, etc. So this is, in a sense, like something already existing before the standardization of the triplex Accius. And we don't see much of this, of course, but it's not even necessarily lines or battle lines of large amount of forces. We're talking about different units that are fighting, more scattered, like placed on different terrain, just like not being the larger army that needs that also more collective training that, for example, a single line still does require, as we were observing before. So remember, the most typical engagement would be if not a guerrilla kind of warfare, because again, these were the Latins already had large amount of forces of, proto-urbanization and, wide spaces and so on. So there were pretty impactful clashes, etc. But imagine again all these various avant-posts scattered in the Roman countryside, raiding, attacks at strongholds. So something much more. In fact, also where a man-at-arm has to always be the spearhead of the formation rather than just imagine a feudal reality, a medieval reality almost. Right? With the legion divided into tribes, Rome has established de facto an organized and properly Roman force. Right? It would take time before this system would evolve into a truly unitary one, right? Obviating the uncertainty of private armies that fought on demand and political request of greater individual power. Managing to regulate individualism would take a very long time, will never be fully accomplished, because the Roman virtus was always accompanied to discipline, right? Unlike Thucydides, that in the Peloponnesian War at some point says that discipline alone is sufficient. The Romans understood that no, you must need the virtus as well, and the discipline. Otherwise, you don't go anywhere. Just a person devoid of any form of emotion, it does not exist. You must unleash that, again, Apollonian capacity from the taming of internal forces. And so in this more warlike society that still had de facto oligarchs ruling very differently, of course, from the classical Greeks, there was a much deeper, awareness, generalized awareness of what the sense what was passing from a warrior to a soldier was made of. So the sense that these forces, the private armies, the senatorial retinues essentially, and the individualism of the various warriors were to be brought at least to the service of a collective interest is established, right? In the moment in which Rome is recognized as a daughter of the gods, as a goddess herself, and that she is sacred, and she has this mission that is embodied again by the eternal fire burning and guarded, and this devotion to the higher deity, etc. The ethnic differences of the tribes are not denied, but harmonized in the same unit, with the same creed, with the same belief, with the same cohesion, right? In a collaborative and competitive mechanism that makes them glue together through conflict, because war is always it's the most potential destroyer of civilizations, but also the most powerful hybridizer, right? And as a consequence, the Roman nobility emerged as especially after the fall of the Etruscans, but already before, throughout this thing, but those who would be able finally to evaluate the capacity of all to the sole end of absolute divinity. So the contribution of individuals is evaluated, but is put at the service of a success that is equally personal and collective. You couldn't have the same thing. You see that thing I said before about the virtus and the discipline. You cannot have one without the other. You could not have had the Roman victory, for example, at Suessa, if the son of the council had not engaged in that clash with the Latin, even going against his father. His destiny at that point was to die, because his father molded it, right? But it's both at the same time. It's destiny, but it's also made. It's the coexistence of virtus and discipline as the coexistence of free will and determinism at the same time. Everything that happens is both a choice of ours, as much as what had to be anyway. And it doesn't make any sense, civilizationally, in Catholic tradition, to presume otherwise, right? So the need that you, let's say, what you owe, it's just rights and duties. They cannot exist without one another. You cannot have a society that only has rights, that believes that things just must be just for some strange reason and without any meaning to it. You will not have anything at that point. Everything is meaningless. Everything is worthless. It's just a pure abstraction. And this is what the Romans had basically interiorized as in the process in which they decided to reverse this trend in the world and forming this force. Now, there wasn't even a citizenry proper by this point, right? Of course, one was understood to be Roman, but the entire sense of the classes, were much more like spontaneous, traditional, right? It was also a greater capacity to emerge from the ranks at this point in a tribal situation, etc. In any case, the common condition of a Roman citizen began to act like as a sort of background, or as a, identitarily speaking, as a powerful counterweight to the same diversity by ethnicity or census that we highlighted. Right, the sense was not to highlight that diversity, but to unify on the basis of the divine standard. Right, unification can happen by deification or to annihilation. Communism wants humanity to die. That's the ultimate step. There must be no meaning whatsoever. Nobody has to think that they can be better than anyone else. Divinity has to do with this community realizing that the only direction towards they have to be oriented is heaven, and rejecting any compromise with the rest. At least understanding always that in tradition you cannot attain that level of transfiguration without taming, but in this sense having the darker forces within you. That's the plebs, the tectonic mass that is also pretty dangerous from a military point of view, because there are many, and they're also under the Etruscan kings reaching an important level of technical crafts, etc., and wealth and commerce that of course the nobility manages from the top of their military quality, and that leads politically. But we know how strained that interaction was. The nobility wanted to maintain the right of arms, and so citizenry and nobility, just for them, eventually they extended it to all of them, because these people was functionalized altogether in subjugating all the others, and so being by themselves noblemen, as we've seen as freemen, which was already by the way, a precondition of the Indo-European background of these peoples. Yes, there were slaves, there were serfs, half-free, freedmen, etc. But the sense is that everybody could become free if they were powerful enough. And that, again, was not to be said by someone, but to be proven by action. So that's why also the plebs eventually does get that power, because it's recognized by the nobility that force is capable of threatening their own old feudal clanic system, and that especially Rome cannot rise as an hegemonic power without the force of the people. That must be a good people, right? Not a weak one. And so there was evidently an ambition and an opportunity to there was not a classist division. The divisions within Rome were also vertical, meaning that there were different clans that had lots of plebs following them, and so they were just competing with one another as much as there was a tension between the lower and the higher strata, right? But that's what compacts the system. So you do have the Roman virtues embodied in the fact that each warrior fought for himself and for the restricted community to which he belonged. So their family, their clan, their tribe, which would then recognize him and share with him the glory gained in the field. Those were the guys on top that redistributed the loot, that rewarded the faithful, the clients, etc. But still, this was done jointly for Rome. It was definitely emerging as a blessed city, aside from the sacred boundaries that were traced originally, because exactly was believed that Rome had done something terrible, as beautiful in being founded in the first place, and evidently mirroring that divine favor. And so being part of it was just a privilege, as the entire Roman, being a Roman citizen, would basically remain to be. And precisely in this period, a warrior spirit took shape among the Romans that made of an epic very similar to that of other civilizations, with the Roman heroes, again, not different from the Homeric ones and the Nordic sagas, but which, say, for the way they were represented historically, literally, etc., in oral tradition, mostly in this case. But you see, there is an initial literacy. Already from this time, Latin starts becoming a literary language, even though in very primitive way still. It's not before the 3rd century that it blossoms like, say, others in Britain culture, but which also assumes, in fact, the unique characteristic of the civic value of the heroic action. This is incredibly important, that while the civic element, the sense of the urbs, the polis, was connected to a sort of rejection, like for example in Greece, of an overall master, and surely cities had that inclination. Rome instead began to feel herself as the heart of the world, and so a sort of earthly heaven that had to be extended to all the rest of the world, in virtue of her spiritual superiority over all the other peoples that in fact she conquered, exactly for this reason. So this sense of, for example, honoring the individual and the family to which he belongs as his personal virtues, that the Romans were quite attached to, benefit the wider community of the city as such, because there were some common values shared that at the end of the day were the highest ones, weren't relativistic about the power of Rome as a mere city, but as a reflection of divine power reborn on earth through the Romans, through their spiritual race. So Rome refines essentially over time a peculiar civic culture that will have great weight, not so much in victories, but above all when she had to recover from defeats, right? Demonstrating cohesion, the fasces, a capacity for sacrifice, and a resistance to unprecedented difficulties in human history. This is often just romanticized, like saying, well, but what Rome did was just like a set of stories, right? And it's just other peoples did the same. Was it? This city conquered the known world of the time from being a city. I mean, in Italy there had never been anything like, I don't know, another empire, another civilization in an imperial sense, like you say, I don't know, Mesopotamia or Egypt or whatever. This thing basically boomed out of nothing and took over the known world. And this thing was never, and still has never been accomplished by anyone. In relative terms, there is no other power in human history that achieved what Rome did. And this is the most important aspect of this seminal phase of Romanity. Because without the awareness of these times, you cannot objectively appreciate the actual meaning, essence, and character of the entire Roman history and empire. So today's video is fairly long because, of course, there's a lot to say, especially regarding this moral background, but understanding how, of course, this group of settlements managed to merge together into an urbs, a city, and even one that managed to take over the entire Latium, for example, in an epoch of hundreds of years that of these cities had been fighting against one another, etc., with that sense of still quite privatistic culture, of sense that there wasn't quite a public authority other than the one made de facto by people, so like such, one would rise, one would fall. Well, here it's affirmed potently through the same military achievement in the affirmation of Rome over all these other peoples as Rome. Reflect on this, right? This is not, again, a mere, there is a power that became hegemonic at some point because they were favored by the circumstances or they were good at it, but fundamentally also they thought of some internal balance. The Romans had, from this time onwards, the ineliminable conviction that they would have had to conquer the world, because in their religion, in the religion of the universe, they knew that there was no other way to accomplish this without the pure faith in God that would have had no other outcome possible but this world transfiguration through the ultimate sacrifice of this entire community in war. And so the elevation, the management in the surpassing of the human dimension into the eternal glory that again has never been accomplished by any other people in this political and military and social way comparatively. So spiritually speaking, of course, Rome, it's difficult to say this because you may argue that Rome has acquired a metaphysical meaning in the history of mankind at this point, unlike any other, and that was how they believed it for a good millennium and a half after after the end of Rome, up to a few centuries ago, until essentially we believed in God. All the great ancient regime figures were based on classical divinity, were not based on national identity. This is deeply relevant, not just because of the apotheosis, etc., but because we historically recognize that Rome was the only one to have achieved this. And this is yet another thing that has been essentially removed from our knowledge. For purposes that I will explain also in another video that are deep and complex, but let's say those who studied these things and hated Rome because they realized that they couldn't achieve what Rome could, right? I'm talking even Marx, for example, etc. They wanted to eliminate the very meaning, like from public knowledge of this achievement. And it's very difficult to explain this to that degree, right? But that's why I'm making this entire work and why this fits unavoidably with the sense that whatever was happening here has a meaning that surpasses practically any other. History is not a collection of memes, it's a collection of meaning. right? It's a collection of knowledge that has a common meaning, right, in a hierarchically organized one. Naturally, today I could talk a lot about other aspects of Roman feudal warfare, so likely I may make a video, by the way, about the enemies of Rome during this period. That is quite interesting. We will talk about, again, the introduction of, say, order as tactics means, like in the Hellenic way in Rome, so the Roman source. We'll talk about the further development of the system. We will talk also about the Indo-European migration. We'll talk about the symbols, the religious symbols of Rome, and why they truly were the civilization of the axe and the deer, and why great part of the symbolism is scattered in basically everywhere, but most people do not even realize it. Both as common background of all these peoples, but also of the sublimation by Rome herself. True, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.